So without further ado, I'll ask Professor Christopher Coker to start the proceedings. And feel free to sit here or to get up to the rostrum, whichever makes you all feel comfortable.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It was very kind of my esteemed colleague, Professor Cox, to share my pension plans with this audience. I am reminded, of course, it is true, I do have a long-term investment in American preeminence, but I'm reminded of that great line by Groucho Marx, who's the Minister of War in some Ruritanian state. It's in Duck Soup, when he's just told that peace has broken out. He's absolutely infuriated about this and says, there must be a war because I've got a 3-month down payment on the battlefield. And I have a long down payment on the US remaining the number one power and the transatlantic alliance still being with us, but it's not in very good shape. And I think the terms of engagement with history, and I'm sorry to use the H word here, history, is what is going to ensure that the US remains number one, but if it doesn't change its terms of engagement with history, it's going to have a very bad landing. The transatlantic alliance suffered from two moments of extraordinary arrogance or hubris, the American unipolar moment in the 1990s and the European Union with enlargement, thinking somehow cosmopolitanism was breaking out right across the world. The unipolarity was caught very well, I think, by Francis Fukuyama's thesis about the end of history, which has been much misunderstood. But the point about that thesis was that no one at the time imagined that there would be a challenge to modernity from outside the Western world, and no one was talking about China or India, largely because Japan had gone into eclipse. People were talking about the rebirth of history, not the end of history elsewhere in the non-Western world. Remember the Asian values discussion in the 1980s, that Asian values are superior to Western values? Well, that's just been translated into the Asian century, which we're looking towards. Now, unipolarity was also, unfortunately, reinforced by the revolution in military affairs, which in a sense, I mean, if any country thinks that it can win a war, 100% guarantee that it will win every time, you're going to have wars. I think in that sense, you remember the Washington Insider, I think it was Ken Edelman, who said that it was going to be a cakewalk. The revolution in military affairs is what insurance people call moral hazards. That if you have a life insurance policy, you'll take more risks. That if you're a Formula One racing driver, you'll take the risks of being a Formula One racing driver because you're a better driver than the rest of us. If you've got a revolution in military affairs, you'll do the war in Iraq. You remember those logos on the T-shirts of young Kosovars in the run-up to the Kosovo War, NATO just do it? And remember President Clinton's excuse for the Monica Lewinsky scandal in his memoirs, I did it because I could. I think that's why we had Iraq. The US could do it and did it. Now that's come to an end, I'm glad to say. We now talk about the counter-revolution in military affairs, and that's all for the good. The other thing that went wrong, of course, was that the United States just didn't notice that its position as the number one power was being gradually eroded, and it's been eroded in the last 5 years. A national debt now approaching $9 trillion, a trade imbalance, $800 billion last year, level of oil imports, 60% dependency on imports of oil. Now, this is a gap between the aspirations of the presidential candidates, people like Senator McCain, who says, we make history, we don't respond to it, and the means by which you make history, which are becoming increasingly costly. And I'm afraid that none of the presidential candidates seem to have woken up to the fact that the circumstances that they will be operating in as president are going to be very different from they were in 2001, and quantitatively very different from what they were when Bill Clinton was president as well. The other thing I would say is that we had a permissive environment in the 1990s, a permissive environment in which the West could do what it liked, could fight any war that it wanted to, with or without United Nations approval. That permissive environment has gone. Russia's back in the equation. Okay, Russian power's overstated, the Russians love being noticed, the Chinese like not being noticed for the moment in history. But the point is that Russia now does have, to some extent, a veto over our actions, and China will be exercising its veto in the United Nations quite soon, rather than just abstaining, which has been the permissive environment, the invention of the abstention. So this is the end of what Bill Clinton used to call the strategic pause. We're back in a completely new game, and the alliance has to get real about it. I think I was reading a marvelous book by P.J. O'Rourke the other day, Peace Kills. There's a great line about Iraq. Sure, we've made a mess of Iraq, but it's our mess. And remember, it's a mess with a message. Don't mess with us. I'm afraid that if you are going to look at the world through Vladimir Putin's point of view, which I'm loath to do at the best of times, but occasionally I try to, by effort of imagination, put myself in, you will see that we've made a hell of a mess of the world in the last 10 years. We've made a mess of Iraq and we're making a mess of Afghanistan. We've got to start seeing our actions through the eyes of others who will soon, and do have a point of view, and will soon want to express that point of view. I think one of the sad things that's happened on George Bush's watch is that the Shanghai Coordination Organization is becoming the second global alliance now. The second global alliance. Largely because NATO is fighting an unwinnable war in Afghanistan. By the way, I think we should be in Afghanistan, but it should be a coalition of the willing. It shouldn't be a NATO operation. So what would I like to see for the transatlantic alliance? I'd like to see two things. I'd like to see a president who says to the American people, we've got to be an ordinary country, but ordinary countries can do extraordinary things. It's tough because I don't see any presidential candidate willing to say we're going to be an ordinary country. But unless the US accepts that it's an ordinary country, it can't remain the preeminent power for the next 25 or 30 years. I'd like to see a president who, in a sense, takes quite seriously George Bush's message in the 2002 State of the Union address, where he talked about defending the non-negotiable demands of human freedom. It's a great phrase. I'm not quite sure what it means, but I like the sound of it. The fact is that, yes, there are things that are non-negotiable, but we will have to negotiate the rest. We've got to get into the negotiating business because we're now sharing this planet with countries that do not share our values, that have alternative models and visions of where they want the future to be. We've got to get into the negotiating business. And finally, I'd like to see a NATO that returns home to doing what it should be doing, which is a European security alliance. The French, of course, have said that they don't want NATO to be a vague ensemble. They want it to be a real alliance. Who would listen to anything the French have to say? It's Peter and the Wolf. But actually, the French are right for the first time in my living memory. The French are right about NATO, and the US and the UK in talking about a global alliance and a league of democracies is wrong. So I would like NATO to come back home. And on that note, I shall end. That's for 7 minutes.
Absolutely perfect timing.
Two responses, really. First, to Jamie Shea's point. I don't think it's NATO's business to fight wars. I think it's NATO's business to provide security. And it should go back to what it did extremely well during the Cold War years. What we're seeing in Afghanistan is a fair degree of what I would call strategic retrenchment. It's fascinating that we had Richard Dannett last year in a speech in London saying, what are we trying to achieve in Afghanistan is success, however you define that. Or we had Anthony Zinni saying in Washington last year, what we're trying to achieve, we should be trying to achieve in Afghanistan is progress, however you define that. The great thing about coalitions of the willing is that they redefine the problems when they become particularly problematic. They keep changing the script and telling themselves different stories, which is fine. NATO can't tell itself different stories. If you're investing NATO as a value alliance in determining a particular outcome, it's stuck with the original story. So that's one reason why I think that it's... Now, on the question of the United States, yes, I perfectly agree that no American president is ever going to stand up and say we're an ordinary country, nor do I think that the United States is, in a sense, an ordinary country. It's a very old country. It's the oldest great power. It's the oldest constitution in the world. It's the oldest democracy in the world. And it's still imprisoned in a certain 19th century version of what its purpose is, what the project is, that it's not a country, it's a project. It was G.K. Chesterton who said when he went to the United States in the 1920s, I look forward to the United States joining the 20th century. At the moment, he said it's the 19th century. I look forward to the United States becoming a 21st century country, not being ordinary in the sense of not having aspirations for the rest of us, particularly we Europeans, because if America didn't dream on our behalf, we'd be in a really bad pickle, because we don't dream ourselves. Someone has to do the dreaming for us. But to start dreaming a somewhat different script. That's all I'm saying. I really do think that it's what Andrew Bacevich says is the problem of the political class in the United States, that hasn't really come to terms with the new power realities, or isn't willing to admit to itself what the new power realities are likely to be. So I'm not asking for the US to be modest in its ambition, either for itself or for anyone else, particularly its allies. But I am asking for a slightly different script. Again, we go back to the script and the story it tells itself about what its purpose should be in the world in the next 25 to 30 years.